Welcome back for Chapter 6, Real Estate Principles, BRE 100. Chapter 6 covers contracts. Now, there are a lot of slides in this chapter, so some I will probably glance through, but we will be covering all of these items. Okay, contract, agreement to do or not do an act or service. So there's certain categories of contracts. One is express, promise for an act; unilateral, promise for an act; executed, which is a completed contract; implied, which is a contract created by actions; bilateral, promise for a promise, so it's bi, meaning two promises; and executory, which is some action needed. Okay, so contracts in real estate will include listings, purchase agreements, and leases. Implied is when an agreement is made by acts and conduct rather than words. A bilateral, two promises, one promise for another. Unilateral is when one party makes a promise for an act of another. The old radio stations would have contests. So a contest would be like a unilateral contract. So if you're caller 9 and you have the answer, we'll give you an award or concert tickets. That's an example of a unilateral contract. Okay, classification of contracts. Valid means binding and enforceable. It's a valid contract. Voidable means that the contract can be voided, but is not necessarily void. Void means there's no contract that exists, so no rights are enforceable. Unenforceable means that it's a valid contract, but for some reason it cannot be enforced in court. One would be like if the contract was illegal and material, meaning like if I gave a contract to somebody to supply me with illegal drugs, that would be unenforceable because it's not a legal matter. Okay, so life of a contract, the phases are negotiation, not yet performed, and then completed. Negotiation occurs before the contract's been struck or been agreed to. Offers made, additional offers and counter offers can happen. Once an offer is accepted by all parties, that contract is created. Not yet performed, you'll hear the term we're in escrow. That's a not yet performed contract. So it's midstream, it's in the process of being performed, but it's not yet there. And then completion is like closing. Once the contract is completed and the statute of limitations, it extends until the statute of limitation runs out. Executed contract is a contract that's been discharged or performed. Okay, execute is to sign a contract. I know on the last slide it said executed means a contract has been performed, but another term to sign means to execute. Execution is the act or performing or carrying out the contract. And an executed contract is one that's either been discharged or performed. So to execute the contract is sign it, but if you say it's executed, that doesn't mean it's been signed, it means it's been performed. So it can be a little tricky and confusing, but just understand the difference there. Okay, here are the elements. So there's 5 elements: capacity, legality, sometimes it needs to be in writing, sufficient consideration, and mutual consent. So with a contract, it's to remember that the following are not essential elements. You do not need money. Some contracts do not need to be in writing, and you do not need performance. Okay, so capacity means you have the mental capacity to contract. Minors, incompetent people, and some convicts do not have those rights. Mutual consent means that there's a genuine offer by one party and a genuine acceptance by the other. So both parties mutually consent. Okay, an offer is a willingness to enter into a contract. The offerer or is the one who's made the offer, giving the offer. And I went over this earlier. At the end of the word, if it says E, it's normally the person receiving the offer, and that is true here too. The offeree is normally the seller who's receiving the offer from the buyer. Exists when the offerer communicates an offer to the offeree with the intention of forming a binding contract, is a contractual intent. It does not exist with a social invitation or advertisement. Okay, so terms of a contract have to be definite and certain, and it has to contain a price, financing terms, and a description of the property. Illusory contract is one where the terms are not definite and certain, therefore the contract is unenforceable. So illusory just means that the description of the terms were not done well enough in order to enforce a contract. Acceptance. Okay, silence cannot be interpreted as acceptance. It has to be done in the manner specified in the offer, normally by signature and writing. Any counter offer automatically constitutes a rejection of the original offer, proposal of new offer. So when you have a counter offer, let's say a buyer offers $600,000 and the seller counters back at $620,000, then the seller is now the offeror and the buyer is the offeree. So the two parties switch places every time that there's a counter offer given. Okay, so certain things can terminate an offer, a lapse of time. So there's always a deadline of when the offer has to be accepted. Communication revocation. So the offeror can terminate their offer if the offeree has not accepted. And if the offeree has a condition that they must fulfill and they don't, then the offer is terminated. Okay, rejection. The offeree can reject or make a counteroffer. So anytime there's a counteroffer made by an offeree, then the parties switch and it's rejected with a counteroffer. If either party dies or no longer has the capacity to make a contract, that voids an offer. If the purpose is illegal, as I described earlier, that contract is void. And if there is a counteroffer again, then that automatically terminates all previous offers, and now there's a new offer. Okay, so the consent has to be genuine and real. So there has to be no fraud, no mutual mistake, and that's when both parties are mistaken to the matter of the agreement. Cannot have any duress, which is the unlawful detention of a person or his property. No menace, which is a threat to commit duress. And no undue influence. That's when a person of authority takes advantage, an unfair advantage of somebody that they have control over. So if any of these items occur, then you do not have genuine consent and you do not have a contract. Okay, so the contract does need to be legal in both formation and operation. And the consideration and its objective must also be lawful. Consideration is anything given a value from one party to another. It can be a benefit to a party, a loss, or agreed to be suffered, an agreement not to bring a legal suit. Payment of money is not needed as adequate consideration, but it normally is the consideration as money. And certain contracts, all contracts in real estate, as far as sales contracts, have to be in writing. There are some tenancy contracts that do not have to be in writing, month-to-month tenant contracts, but everything else pretty much needs to be in writing. Parole evidence rule is just assuming that the written agreement that's there is the contract. Okay, so nothing else exists except for what's written. It prohibits the introduction of any prior agreements as evidence in a court action. So the final agreement is so the last thing written is what rules, except if the contract is incomplete, ambiguous, or may not be enforceable because of mistake or fraud, then you can introduce prior agreements that may have been made prior to the final agreement. Okay, this is the statute of frauds means the contracts need to be in writing. I would suggest you go ahead and read all of this information. Okay, performance of a contract. The successful completion of a duty, usually resulting in the release from any past or future liability, that is the performance of a contract. You can assign the contract to another party. That's called an assignment. The assignor is the one that transfers rights. The one that receives the rights are the assignee. Again, the EE at the end. Novation is a substitution of a new contract for the old one. It's very rare. Okay, so there are 8 ways to discharge a contract. Full performance, meaning the contract has fully been performed. Substantial performance, meaning the contract has been performed enough that both parties agree they can walk away. Partial, impossibility of performance, meaning you can no longer perform. It's impossible. You can agree, the 2 parties can agree to discharge the contract. Let's say they no longer want to work together. You can discharge that contract. Operational law, acceptance of breach, and breach. Okay, the statute of limitations is different for different acts. So I would encourage you to read the statute of limitations so that you can understand what actions are 6 months, year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. In general, most things in real estate are 3-year statute of limitations, meaning you have 3 years from the time that the contract is discharged to bring up some form of legal action due to a misrepresentation of that contract. Okay, so when you have a breach of contract, there's certain remedies. One is acceptance, so you just move forward. Unilateral rescission, meaning that the one person has decided to rescind the contract. Action for dollar damages, that could be a court order, award, or something like that. And then possible action for specific performance. So if there's a breach, the court can force a party to perform the contract in some certain instances. Okay, so acceptance of breach, the wronged party does not pursue any kind of legal action. Okay, in the unilateral rescission, the wrong party discloses the wrong and restores everything of value to the offending party. Grounds for rescission are fraud, mistake, duress, menace, undue influence, and faulty consideration. And then minors or incompetents may generally rescind their contracts because they didn't have capacity. So basically, in the unilateral rescission, everything goes back to how it was before. Okay, action for dollar damages. Court suit for breach requests payment of a fixed amount of money as compensation. A liquidated damages agreement sets in advance a specified amount of money as compensation if there is a breach. Liquidated damages in real estate sales contracts are the deposit, up to 3.5% of the sales price. So if your deposit is $10,000, then that would be your liquidated damages amount, as long as the damages were greater than $10,000. And again, specific performance is forcing a party to perform the terms of the contract. The court will only consider this option if dollar damages cannot provide an adequate remedy, and the contract must be shown to be just and reasonable, and the contract must have been made based on adequate consideration. The only type of specific performance that I could think of is when a certain seller who is an investor is agreed to sell a property to a purchaser who cannot find a like property. If that's the only type of property that can be purchased and there's something specific about that property, the court will force the seller to sell. Okay, digital forms. All forms now are available in a digital format. It's very nice because this does save time. Okay, the purchase agreement package. Offer and acceptance. California purchase agreement instructions offer and deposit to purchase a specific property on certain terms and conditions. The contract will spell out the commissions that's paid to the brokers. And then when using pre-printed forms, any handwritten parts have control over the printed parts, and all corrections must be initialed by both parties. So this might seem a little odd, but if you handwrite something on the contract and then you sign it, whatever's handwritten, if it doesn't agree with what was pre-typed, the handwritten rules over the pre-typed information. Okay, the disclosure regarding real estate agency, the DA, we've seen this in a prior chapter. There's 3 different types of agency disclosure: seller, buyer, or dual. And this is the form here. And you can see there's check boxes for seller, landlord, tenant, buyer, seller, landlord, tenant, and then the actual agent signs on the bottom. Okay, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. This is just informing your clients that the agent can have multiple buyers and sellers that they represent, and it can be a dual agency situation where the agent represents both parties. Okay, wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. Just inform the public that wire fraud does exist and you shouldn't send money anywhere except for where your escrow officer asks you to do so. Okay, the listing agreement. This is the most used listing is authorization and right to sell. There is a copy of this in your book. I would encourage you that you read it so you can understand what's in the listing agreement. Okay, paper versus digital. Your client should dictate the method by which you fill out and complete the purchase agreement. Okay, this can be kind of tough if they want paper. I have had clients who do not have email addresses because they're older. In that case, you have to use paper. And it's okay to use paper, it's just you're going to scan it and email it later anyway. All contracts need to be in writing or digital form to be enforceable. And the filled-in contract forms can be emailed to your client via smartphone or computer, saves time in the process. Very true. It's very rare I don't use those methods. Okay, the deposit. Once you make an offer and it's accepted and you enter into escrow, now it's most commonly wired into escrow. The covenants is a promise between parties to a contract. Contingencies, conditions are subject to or provisions by which all parties are released from any obligation in the event that some of the stated occurrence fails to materialize. The most common contingency that's used is availability of financing. So if you're unable to obtain a loan and you have a contingency on a loan, then you won't be able to perform the contract because you basically can't fund that loan, can't get the money. So that's a contingency that comes up the most. There are others, though. Okay, backup offers, sellers to remain in possession addendum is another addendum that could be added to the contract. That's when the seller, even after the close of escrow, decides to rent the property back from the buyer. That could be advantageous in certain areas. And also errors and omissions insurance, that's a liability insurance that brokers and salespeople carry in order to avoid lawsuits. Counter offer form. So once you make the offer, if the seller does not agree with the offer, they can choose to make a counteroffer. So instead of doing the whole contract over, you do a one-page form that only discusses the items to change. Normally, what's changing is the sales price. That's the most common thing. Okay, buyer's inspection advisory. Um, that is the form that tells the buyer how important it is to get a property inspection so that they can be satisfied with the physical condition of the property prior to closing the transaction. Okay, an option is a right to purchase within a specified time granted in exchange for money. The option is the one that gives the right to purchase, and the optionee is the one is the potential buyer who receives the option. Again, the double E to the receive. So how this is most widely used is in a tenancy situation where the landlord might give the tenant an option to buy the property at the end of their tenancy agreement. So let's say you have a year lease and you like the property and you want to purchase the property from the owner will give you a price in that lease that you can decide to purchase the property. And that is called a strike price. So if you want further information on that, let me know and then we can discuss that. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you're learning some things about real estate. Again, if you have questions, please send me a message in Canvas or email it, and I'll be sure to provide as much information as possible. Thank you and have a nice day.